In the summer of 1995, an 18-year-old named Hazen Hazanovi walked out of a United Nations safe area and straight into the heart of a genocide. His hometown, Srebrenica, was supposed to be protected. But when Bosnian Serb forces overran it that July, more than 8,000 Bosniak men and boys would be systematically murdered. Hazen survived, but his survival cost him his father, Aziz, and his twin brother, Hussein. It left him with memories that would shape the rest of his life. As the town fell, chaos erupted. Women, children, and the elderly flocked to the Dutch UN base at Podazari, clutching bags in each other, desperately believing the blue helmets of the peacekeepers would shield them. But the men and boys knew they faced a different fate if captured. So Hazen, barely an adult, joined his father and his twin in a massive column of nearly 15,000 men and boys. Their plan was simple to say, but almost impossible to do. March over 100 kilometers through enemy-held territory to reach safety near the city of Tuzla. They moved under the cover of darkness, silent river of humanity stretching through the forest. Fear was their constant companion. It didn't take long for Bosnian Serb forces to find them. Artillery shells exploded among the trees, mortar crashed down, and ambushes shattered any sense of safety. Men dove for cover behind tree trunks, into ditches anywhere that offered a sliver of protection. Those who hesitated were wounded, or were simply too exhausted to go on were left behind or captured. Hazen stayed as close as he could to his father and brother, but the sheer chaos of the bombardment tore the column apart. For days, Hazen's world shrank to the single, desperate task of putting one foot in front of the other, finding water and staying hidden. He and others stood for hours in cold streams and rivers to avoid patrols, afraid to make a sound. Exhaustion was a relentless enemy. Men would fall asleep while walking, drop where they stood, or wander off, never to be seen again. And then, in the midst of this waking nightmare, surrounded by shelling and confusion, Hazen lost sight of his father and his twin. There was no way to turn back. To stop and search for them meant certain capture or death. He faced an impossible choice: keep moving and pray they had found another path, or die trying to find them. He chose to survive, a decision that he knew, even in that moment, would haunt him forever. After 6 agonizing days, Hazen finally reached Bosnian-held territory. He was dehydrated, starved, and deeply traumatized, but he was alive. So many who had started the march with him never made it. In the months and years that followed, the full horrific scale of the Srebrenica genocide became clear. Thousands of men and boys from that forest column and from the area around the UN base had been captured, executed, and buried in mass graves. For Hazen, these weren't just numbers. They were his family, his friends, his neighbors. His father and twin brother were among the missing, their whereabouts unknown for years. Slowly, international forensic teams began the grim work of exhuming mass graves. Using DNA analysis, they started to identify the dead piece by piece. Eventually, Hazen received the news he had both dreaded and waited for. The remains of his father, Aziz, and his twin, Hussein, had been found. He took part in their burial at the Srebrenica Podazari Memorial Cemetery, laying them to rest among thousands of other white gravestones. He would later say that burying his father and his twin changed my life forever. It was the moment hope finally gave way to the crushing weight of certainty. The abstract horror of genocide became once again brutally personal. In post-war Bosnia, there was little to no psychological support for survivors like Hazen. The country itself was shattered, dealing with economic collapse and deep political division. He carried his nightmares, flashbacks, and grief almost entirely alone. For a while, he tried to cope by staying silent, burying the memories under the routine of daily life. But silence didn't heal him. It only isolated him. And in that silence, something else began to grow: denial. Over the years, voices emerged that tried to downplay or outright deny what had happened at Srebrenica, challenging the very word genocide. For someone who had walked through that hell and buried his own family, this denial felt like a second assault, an attack on his memory and on the dignity of the dead. Faced with this, Hazen made another crucial choice. Instead of retreating further into his pain, he began to speak out. He shared his story in interviews and lectures, and eventually wrote a memoir surviving Srebrenica. He described the fall of the town, the terrifying march through the forest, the separation from his family, and the long, agonizing aftermath of grief and searching. Writing forced him to revisit the darkest corners of his mind, but he came to see it as a duty to himself, to his family. Hazen also returned, physically, to the site of his trauma. He started working at the Srebrenica Podosari Memorial Center, guiding visitors through the exhibitions and along the endless rows of white gravestones. When he walks with students, diplomats, and tourists past those graves, he's not just a guide reciting dates and facts. He is a survivor, giving names and faces to the staggering numbers. He explains how a UN safe area failed, how neighbors were turned into targets, and how the poison of hatred and dehumanization paved the way for mass murder. Today, when Hazen addresses young audiences, he often says his goal isn't to make them feel guilty, but to make them feel responsible for recognizing where hatred can lead, and for defending the truth against the corrosive acid of denial. His journey, from an 18-year-old boy fleeing through a forest to a man standing before the world telling his story, shows that survival is not a single moment in time, but an ongoing, active process. Every time he speaks, he chooses to relive a part of his trauma so that others can learn from it. In this way, Hazen Hazanovic's life has become more than a personal tragedy. It is a living archive of Srebrenica, powerful reminder that behind every statistic, every casualty count, there was a person with a family, a voice, and dreams for the future. He survived a march through hell, buried his father and his twin, and now stands among the graves, a guardian of memory, determined that those who died will never be forgotten, and that the crime committed against them will never be denied. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please consider sharing it so that more people can hear Hazen's voice and learn from his testimony.